South Africa assumes the presidency of BRICS this year. International Relations and Cooperation Minister Dr. Naledi Pandor says the country's tenure will focus on concrete cooperation between BRICS nations that directly and indirectly benefits Africa and the world at large. Well, DIRCO, her department, said South Africa plans to strengthen economic, political, social and cultural cooperation amongst BRIC nations. The expansion of BRICS will also be discussed, with Algeria, Argentina and Iran having applied for membership, while Egypt, Saudi Arabia and Turkey have expressed interest in joining. To discuss, let's chat to Professor Lyal White, a Contextual Intelligence founder and Brenthurst Foundation Research Associate. Professor, thank you for being with us. The first question, presumably, is how does South Africa deal with Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Do you think it will continue with the stance that it won't take sides, that it will push for peace even within BRICS?
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting question, that, because of South Africa's position in terms of its foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia and then the members of the BRICS countries. Obviously, it was a kind of a non-aligned position that it took vis-a-vis the invasion of the Ukraine. But if we take the democratic world at large and the majority of the democratic nations, South Africa is definitely an outlier and looking more and more like a pariah state until it actually joins the other BRIC nations. But let's not forget, there's been an election in Brazil. President Lula da Silva is now in power. It is unlikely that Lula will maintain the position that was taken by Brazil up until now. And we're going to be seeing some interesting times now as we kind of usher in the start of international relations, especially given the crisis that we follow in Europe at the moment, and alongside the BRIC nations as well. So it's going to be a very, very interesting moment for the BRIC nations and South Africa's foreign policy.
Are you saying that the BRICS as a whole may start searching for its own stance on this matter, and South Africa may come under pressure then if the views are different among those nations, or do you think it'll just try and stay away from Ukraine if it can?
No, I think it will probably stay away from Ukraine if it can, to answer your question quite simply. The BRIC nations have never been united on any foreign policy matter. They've been united in what they're opposed to every now and then, but they are united on developmental issues and not so much on foreign policy issues, and they are definitely not united on the invasion of the invasion of the Ukraine. And South Africa is definitely one of those countries that the rest of the world have been looking at and wondering, where do you come from when you have a foreign policy and a position like you've taken on the Ukraine?
All right, like you said, the big change is Brazil. Lula da Silva coming in, and Jair Bolsonaro, he seemed to be following a Trump model. Some suggested that was exacerbating tensions among BRIC nations. What do you think now that da Silva is in charge? Will those tensions start to ease?
Yeah, so I think that's probably the more interesting question right now, because Lula da Silva, obviously, who was really appointed as president just on the 1st of January. This is exactly 20 years after he assumed presidency in 2003 in that same position. He obviously took a very, very important position over for Brazil vis-a-vis the BRIC nations. He was one of the founding kind of fathers of the BRIC nations. He united them. He's united a country before. He's got a tall order ahead of him going forward now, because he has inherited a deeply divided and literally a failing country in the form of Brazil following Bolsonaro. Let's not forget that Bolsonaro was, as you said, he aligned himself very strongly with the Trump administration. Bolsonaro himself actually took flight on Friday just before President Lula da Silva was sworn in, and he went to no other than Mar-a-Lago to watch the inauguration. What is interesting about all of this is that it definitely will change the foreign policy outlook of Brazil. It will change the outlook for the BRICS countries, because Brazil is such an influential country in the BRICS configuration. It is really a leader, and I think there's going to be certain areas in foreign policy, especially environmental issues, that will be pushed to the forefront of the Lula da Silva administration in their foreign policy. And that is something that I think we should watch very, very closely. Whether you are in favor of De Silva or not, this is going to be a very, very important part and a priority for not only Brazil, but for the BRICS nations going forward.
Well, you preempted my next question, because I was thinking while you were talking that perhaps there's an opportunity here. So De Silva is saying he will stop the deforestation when it comes to the Amazon and push to be this green nation. South Africa is fighting around a just transition. I mean, could the BRICS nations come together in a strong way, if not around other major foreign policy issues, but around climate change?
I think that's a fantastic question or point, Francis. It really is a moment, an opportunity, and it's a great moment that we can't squander here in South Africa in aligning ourselves. And, we were always known as a country that punched above our weight in foreign policy or in multilateral forums. We've lost that. We've lost a lot of credibility over the last 10 years or so, especially in recent years, and obviously the situation now in Europe. And I think the climate issue, or the crisis that we've seen in climate change, is an opportunity for South Africa, as it aligns very, very closely with Brazil. And as you said, Lula da Silva has pledged to establish zero deforestation by 2030. He has appointed Marina Silva as the environmental minister. I think South Africa is well positioned, and not only positioned for the country, but for the continent, to drive the climate issue, and which has become a priority in foreign policy and multilateral discussions. So this is a great opportunity, and this is probably a wonderful time for the BRICS to actually gather behind a key global issue, and to probably show some leadership in this particular space going forward.
Prof, now what about the people knocking at the door? Correct me if I'm wrong, but the BRICS came together in the search for an alternative just to the Western model, looking for perhaps new ways of funding, of rating, looking at different ways of doing things, harnessing the clout of the developing world. Now, Saudi Arabia, Iran, I mean, if nations like that were let in, with all the politics around that, would that overshadow the mission in a sense?
Yeah, I think this is a very, very important question, because you might be asking, and I suppose you've alluded to this, but not actually spoken it or said it out loud, is this a collection of democracies, or is it a collection of autocracies? But then again, there's such a blurry line nowadays between the autocracies and those democracies, or those kind of autocratic style of, because we've got Russia and we've got China there as well. Let's not forget about those. And then we've got the great populists of Modi and obviously Bolsonaro in Brazil just before that. So if we allow in the likes of Saudi Arabia, Algeria, some of the others that are knocking on the door, are we not diluting the democratic virtues of what we aspire to as BRICS just 12 years or 13 years ago? I think it's a very, very important point, but BRICS was always punted as an alternative development model, and you alluded to this yourself now by saying an alternative avenue for funding and for development, and it was never ever positioned as a geopolitical alternative. I think that's a very, very important point to highlight right now. Even though we've been talking about this in this very kind of discussion this evening, it was not an alternative to geopolitical issues, but it always comes up, as it has this evening. And I think it's probably an opportunity for countries that are flexing their muscle geopolitically to come together on developmental issues. And I think that's probably something we should focus on. And that's why the climate change and the climate issues are so paramount to the alliance, and why South Africa could align itself very, very closely to the Lula administration. One last point, Lula coming in, and with the Ramaphosa administration now gaining a little bit of momentum, this could be a great opportunity. And once again, we know about Lula's affinity for not only South Africa, but Africa at large. It could be a great opportunity for South Africa-Brazil relations going forward.
Yeah. But finally then, how does South Africa assess the request to join? Some may cynically say South Africa could use BRICS to make good friends with influential nations.
Yeah, but then we could also ask whether Venezuela should be allowed to join the configuration as well, which is not a crazy thought, because it has been floated once before. I think what South Africa needs to do is maybe step back and remind ourselves of our key virtues of our foreign policy, which are steeped in democracy. If we look back to the mid-1990s and where we took our positions in multilateral fora, it was around human rights and the virtues of democracy. But then again, we've got to look at where the real world realities lie going forward and how we actually forge our friendships in the world ahead. But once again, the likes of India and Brazil have always been side by side alongside South Africa in our foreign policy virtues and in our democratic outlook in these types of fora. And we've also often collaborated on multilateral fora, not only the BRICS, but others, the WTO and others, when we've been looking at engaging on global issues or global issues of the South.
All right, a good point to end on. Thank you very much for your time, Professor Lyal White, Contextual Intelligence founder and Brenthurst Foundation Research Associate.